Listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
At 5:30 a.m. on November 13th, 1989, 16-year-old Amy Widener woke up coughing in her upstairs bedroom in Indianapolis, Indiana. Amy's throat burned. She glanced over at the clock on her bedside table and saw how early it still was. Now, normally she would have slept a bit longer before getting up and getting ready for school, but she just kept on coughing, so she knew she was not going to be able to fall back asleep. And she knew she needed to stay home sick today. Amy heard a knock on her bedroom door, and her mother, Gloria, walked inside, holding a 2-year-old little girl in her arms. Her mother said she'd heard Amy coughing, and she wanted to check on her. But Amy barely even heard what her mother was saying. Instead, she was smiling at the little girl. In a big, animated voice, Amy said, "Good morning," and the little girl smiled back, reached out her arms, and said, "Mamie," which was her name for Amy. This little 2-year-old girl was Amy's daughter. The girl's father was a friend of Amy's who was a couple years older than her, but he had never really played a role in the baby's life. When Amy's daughter was born, Amy had loved her immediately, but she had also been terrified. She had no idea how she was going to raise a child on her own, and she thought her life as a normal teenager was basically over. But Amy's mother, Gloria, had done everything in her power to make sure that didn't happen. Gloria had played a huge part in raising this little girl. In fact, Amy's daughter often called Gloria Mom. And Gloria's help, along with the help from some of Amy's teachers, had allowed Amy to not only stay in high school, but to thrive. Amy got good grades, she was a cheerleader, she played clarinet in the high school band, and she even tutored other students in French, a language she absolutely loved. She had dreams of going to college someday, and most people who knew her just assumed she would grow up to be a really cool French teacher someday. Back in the bedroom, Amy told her mother there was just no way she could go to school today with her cough. Her mother agreed and told her that she could still take her baby to the babysitter like she usually did during the week, but Amy said to leave her at home. It'd be nice to spend the day with her little girl. Gloria said okay, and then put the little girl on the bed next to Amy, and then she walked out to get ready for work. As tired and sick as Amy felt, she couldn't stop smiling. She loved that her mother had made it possible for her to still just be a teenager most of the time. However, she missed her daughter a lot when she was at school. And so a day like today, to be alone with her daughter was really special. While Amy sat and talked to her daughter on the bed, her older brother, JP, walked in. The siblings were only a year apart, and they were extremely close. They drove to school together every day and ran in the same circle of friends. And this close-knit group of high schoolers spent almost all of their free time together. JP told his sister to get well and said he'd see her when he got home from school. The house remained loud and full of energy for the next couple of hours while Amy's mom got ready for work and her brother and 2 younger sisters got ready for school. But eventually, everybody cleared out and the house became quiet. Amy continued to sit on her bed and just play with her daughter. In a house with 4 school-age kids and a baby, silence was very rare, so this morning felt extra special. However, that feeling quickly disappeared when Amy heard a door open downstairs. She figured one of her younger sisters must have just forgotten their backpack or something. So Amy cleared her throat and coughed a little, and then called out to see who had come home. A little before noon, a few hours after Amy and the baby had been left alone, Amy's mother, Gloria, pulled her car up to the front of the house. She had called Amy several times from work, but she hadn't gotten an answer. She worried that since Amy was sick, she might have fallen asleep, and she just wanted to make sure Amy and the baby were okay. Gloria got out of her car, rushed up the walkway, unlocked the front door, and walked inside. She called out for Amy, but she didn't hear anything. Then, as she walked through the front room and reached the bottom of the stairs, she froze. Amy's little girl was sitting on the landing at the top of the stairs all by herself, and she was crying. And she had blood on her pajamas. Gloria instantly ran up the stairs and picked up the baby and held on to her tight, and then she ran through the upstairs hallway and called out for her daughter again, but still didn't get any answer. Gloria reached Amy's bedroom and opened the door. She looked over at the bed and immediately began to scream. That afternoon, not long after Gloria had gotten home, Detective Norman Matthews of the Indianapolis Police Department parked in front of Amy's house and stepped outside. Police had already taped off the property, and Detective Matthews saw forensics officers scouring the front yard for evidence. Matthews also saw a woman standing with several uniformed police officers. The woman was crying, but at the same time, she was gently bouncing a little girl in her arms, doing everything she could to make sure the girl wasn't scared or upset. Matthews put on gloves, ducked under the crime scene tape, and walked into the house through the front door. More forensics officers were busy searching both floors of the house, and one of them pointed Matthews upstairs. Matthews walked up the steps, went down the hall, and into Amy's bedroom. A camera flashed as a forensic photographer took pictures of the scene in the bedroom, while Matthews just stood there inside the doorway, staring at the bed. There, he saw Amy Widener's lifeless body. Her face and her red hair were bloody, she was naked, and there was blood all over the sheets and on the wall above her. Matthews stepped closer to the body, and he could see cuts and a deep gash on Amy's forehead, and there was bruising on her throat, arms, and legs. The attack on this young woman looked vicious and uncontrolled, which was horrific enough in and of itself. But when Detective Matthews had gotten the call to come to this house, he'd been informed that this attack had taken place while the victim's 2-year-old daughter was present, and that information made this crime scene much, much worse. Detective Matthews met with the forensics officer who was working in the bedroom. The officer told him that amidst the blood on the wall, they had found what looked like a pretty clear palm print. The officer said the forensics team would carve out that section of the wall to make sure the print was preserved in its entirety, in hopes they could eventually find a match in their databases. For reference, in 1989, DNA testing was still very much in its early stages, and so it was not being used as an investigative tool by the Indianapolis Police Department. Matthews stepped out of Amy's bedroom and, along with several other police officers, started a full search of the house. The front door had apparently been locked when Gloria had come home to check on Amy and the baby, and there was no sign of forced entry. But Matthews and his team found that the sliding glass door on the back patio was unlocked. He also found that Amy's brother's bedroom looked like it had been ransacked. The dresser drawers were open, and it appeared that some pieces of stereo equipment had been pulled out of the wall and stolen. And so on the surface, this murder now looked like it could have been the result of a burglary gone wrong. Maybe someone had shown up to rob the place and heard Amy or the baby upstairs, and then just attacked and killed Amy like a target of opportunity. But as Matthews and his team combed through the rest of the house, something hit him. No other rooms looked like Amy's brother's room. There were no signs of robbery anywhere else. If this was a robbery gone wrong, Matthews figured that whoever did it must have been familiar with the house. They must have known exactly where that stereo equipment was and had come there specifically to get it. Matthews knew he did have a witness that might be able to identify the intruder, especially if the intruder was someone who had been to the house before. But there was a big problem with this, because that witness was just 2 years old. After Matthews and his team had completed their initial search of the house, he met with Amy's mother, Gloria, outside. Gloria was able to confirm that stereo equipment was missing from her son's room. She also said JP usually kept about $50 in cash in a dresser drawer, but that was gone too. Matthews told Gloria that this information was extremely helpful, but there was something more important that he needed from her. He needed her permission for police to question her granddaughter. The idea of putting her granddaughter through any more stress after what that little girl had been through that day made Gloria feel very uneasy. But her daughter had just been brutally murdered, and so she needed the killer to be found and brought to justice. So she agreed to Matthew's request. Gloria and Amy's 2-year-old daughter took a seat on the front porch, along with Detective Matthews and a police officer who specialized in working with young kids. And that officer introduced herself to Amy's little girl and then handed her some finger puppets. And then she asked the little girl to use these finger puppets to tell everybody what had happened that morning. And then that officer and the others watched and listened as the little girl used the finger puppets to act out a scene. She made it look like 2 of the puppets were fighting for a little while, and then she said later on, Mamie was laying on the bed. The little girl had said she had tried to lift Mamie up, but then said Mamie was just too heavy. When Gloria heard her granddaughter say this, she just broke down, and Matthews and the other officer tried not to show how much this affected them. The fact that this little girl had clearly seen her mother get murdered was not something they could just shake off. Eventually, the officer who specialized in working with young kids asked the little girl one more question. Did she know the person who had come into Mamie's room? But all the little girl could remember was that the person was Strong. Detective Matthews told the little girl what a great job she'd done, and then he asked Gloria if he could speak to her alone for a minute. Gloria told her granddaughter to stay with the police officer and she'd be right back. Then she followed Matthews off the porch. Matthews told her that the fact her son's room was the only room that had been robbed led him to believe that the killer was very likely another young person who her kids knew. And very likely they knew in advance that the stereo equipment and the $50 would be in JP's room. So Matthews asked Gloria to come up with a list of names of people who were closest to Amy and JP. Gloria said that Amy and her brother JP hung out with a small group of friends, but she said there was someone outside that group that Matthews should definitely talk to before anybody else: the father of Amy's child, a young man named Tony Abercrombie. And sure enough, the day after the murder, Detective Matthews brought Tony into the station for an interview. Tony was 18 years old, tall with long wavy brown hair, and he wore jeans and a t-shirt. He looked to Matthews like almost every other teenager in the area. The night before, Matthews had seen Tony giving an impromptu interview about Amy's murder on a local news show, and Matthews didn't really know what to think about that. The reporter had most likely shown up at Tony's house unannounced, and it could be difficult for a young man like Tony to tell a reporter to leave him alone, but there was also the possibility that Tony craved the attention. There were plenty of homicide cases throughout history where the killer went out of their way to get their name in the news. However, Matthews was not ready to jump to any conclusions like that. And now, looking at Tony across the table, he could tell this kid seemed very upset and maybe even a bit scared. Matthews told Tony he was not in any kind of trouble. The police just needed to know some things about his relationship with Amy. Tony nodded and told Matthews he'd been good friends with Amy's brother JP. That's how he had met Amy. He said they'd gone out a few times and then ended up sleeping together, and Amy got pregnant. Tony admitted that the idea of becoming a father at his age scared him, and he was not looking forward to the birth of the baby. However, when the baby was born, Amy and Gloria had basically raised her without him. So Tony said he hadn't talked much to Amy since then or had anything to do with his child. He told Matthews he'd gotten a phone call from Amy's friend that Amy had been killed on the morning it happened. Tony said he'd felt completely torn up when she had told him, and in fact, he had to leave work because he was so upset. Tony said he might not have seen Amy very much lately, but he still cared about her. And on top of that, she was one of the sweetest people he'd ever met. It didn't make sense that somebody would want to hurt her. Shortly after that, Matthews got Tony's work details and then told him police would follow up if they needed more information. And then he let him go. Matthews needed to see if Tony really had been at work on the morning Amy had been killed. But based on this one interview he had just done, Tony did not seem like the type of person who had done that TV interview to draw attention to himself. Instead, he just seemed like a kid who was very upset that a girl he'd been with and fathered a child with was now gone. In the days immediately following the murder, the investigative team started to look into a range of Amy's friends and classmates, believing the person who broke in and killed her was most likely someone Amy knew. But, based on what he'd seen at Amy's house, Detective Matthews had also developed a new theory. Maybe there hadn't been a break-in at all. Maybe Amy's brother JP had killed her and then ransacked his own room to try to throw off the police. So, Detective Matthews met with JP multiple times. And in every meeting, JP made it very clear how angry and upset he was that police would even think he could do something like this to his sister. He said he loved Amy, maybe more than anybody else in the whole world. They had been so close ever since they were little kids. But despite these multiple interviews and Detective Matthews' continued interest in JP, the detective did not find anything linking him directly to the crime. His fingerprints were all over the house, including inside of Amy's room, but that was expected. He lived there, so it really didn't mean anything. And there was nothing JP did in the aftermath of the murder that added more suspicion to him. In fact, JP just seemed devastated by the loss of his sister. And then on November 17th, so 4 days after Amy's murder, when Amy's friends and family all gathered together for her funeral, JP shared countless stories about some of the best times he'd spent with his sister. He said because they were so close in age, it was like they weren't just siblings. They were more like really good friends. At the funeral, JP, along with JP and Amy's mutual friend Rodney and some of Amy's girlfriends, did their best to try to console Amy's younger siblings and her mother Gloria. But it felt like an impossible task, because none of them could accept that this had really happened. Following the funeral, Detective Matthews and his team collected the guest book and made a note of everybody at the service who'd signed the book. Many of the guests had been Amy's classmates and her teachers. And so Matthews and his team first met with some of the high school students on the list that they had not already spoken to. But none of these interviews really led anywhere. All of them just sort of ended with the students talking about how much they were going to miss their friend. And at the same time, Matthews still didn't have any real concrete evidence, like any information on the bloody palm print that had been found in Amy's room. So one afternoon, in the week following the murder, Matthews walked down a long hallway lined with lockers at Amy's high school. School was already out, so there were only a handful of students who were still there. Matthews turned down a different hallway with classroom doors on either side and found the French classroom. He walked in and saw Amy's French teacher, Jody George, waiting for him. Matthews had heard from several people that Jody was Amy's favorite teacher, and so he told Jody this, and this immediately made Jody break down into tears. She told the detective that Amy had always been a great student, but the real reason that she and Amy had connected was actually because they both had been raising babies at the same time. Jody's child was born not too long after Amy's daughter had been born, and so Amy and the teacher shared parenting tips with each other and bonded over being new mothers. Matthew's hope was that in meeting with Jody, that perhaps she could point him towards other students who were maybe Amy's friends, but who didn't attend the funeral. Detective Matthews ended up getting a list of students that Amy had tutored in French, and he asked Jody if any of these kids might have had a problem with Amy. But Jody said no, not that she knew of. And then over the next several days, as Matthews went down this new list of students, it didn't really go anywhere. Because once again, all these students could say was just that they really liked Amy, and they couldn't believe she was gone. By the end of November, about 2 weeks after the murder, Matthews felt like he had spoken to every high school kid in town, and he still wasn't any closer to finding Amy's killer. Tony Abercrombie, the father of Amy's daughter, looked like he had a solid alibi, as did her brother JP, who was seen in class by multiple people at the time his sister was killed. And when Matthews finally got the results on that bloody palm print that had been on the wall in Amy's room, it didn't match Tony or JP's prints. It also did not match any of Amy's friends that police had interviewed, or any prints in any criminal database. So Matthews felt like he basically had nothing, and now he wondered if he'd just been plain wrong the whole time. Maybe Amy didn't know her killer, and it was just some random stranger that had broken into the house and killed her. And if that was the case, it meant the suspect pool could basically include almost anyone. Matthews and his team continued to follow any potential leads, and they returned to the crime scene to see if there was anything they might have missed. But as 1990 began and several more months passed, it became clear the police had no real suspects. Amy's family still got together with Amy's friends and that French teacher Jody to share stories and keep Amy's memory alive, but most of them came to believe that her murder would never be solved. And as even more time went by with no new leads, some members of the investigative team started to feel the same way. And eventually, Detective Matthews and the rest of the investigative team had to focus on new cases. And so Amy's murder case went cold, and it would stay that way for a long, long time. Fast forward to 2002, so 13 years after Amy's murder. Detective Roger Spurgeon, the lead cold case detective at the Indianapolis Police Department, got a call at his desk. And when he answered, he heard a man's voice, and this man sounded totally afraid. The man told the detective that the previous night he'd had these horrible dreams about the murder of Amy Widener that had taken place back in 1989. The man said he worked at the school where Amy had gone, so he had known her, but not very well. But now he was having these visceral dreams about her death, and so he felt like he just needed to pass on what he was seeing in these dreams because he believed maybe it could help police solve the murder, which in turn could make these terrible dreams go away. Detective Spurgeon just sat at his desk, stunned by what he was hearing. Getting bizarre phone calls about old homicide cases was not totally unheard of. Usually they didn't lead to anything. But this man sounded genuinely upset. And so, operating on a hunch, Spurgeon took down notes on these dreams the caller was having. And after the call was over, Spurgeon pulled Amy's case file. The caller's supposed dreams did give a lot of details about Amy's murder. But for the most part, these details had all been covered in the press at the time of Amy's death, or in the years following. Spurgeon figured this caller was not the most dependable source, but he couldn't just let this go. After all, this man could have details about the murder, not because he was dreaming it, but because he was involved. And so the detective dug into this man's background, and he discovered that he did in fact work at Amy's high school, like he had said. So Spurgeon went to the school and met with several teachers and administrators who knew the caller, and many of them had actually worked at the school when Amy was killed as well. Now, during these initial few conversations, nothing really stood out to Spurgeon, but then the school's guidance counselor told Spurgeon something that was really strange. They told him that they knew who the man was who claimed to have these dreams about Amy, and they said this man could not have killed her, because on the morning of Amy's murder, that man, the caller, had been working at the school. And the guidance counselor said on the day of the murder, this person, this man, kind of out of nowhere, had this violent episode where he just started screaming and kicking things. In fact, his episode had gotten so bad that eventually the counselor had to help the man out of the school and drive him home. This was definitely a new one for Detective Spurgeon. He'd gotten some strange calls before, but this man's dreams and now his episode on the morning of the murder were something else. Spurgeon followed up with the man who had called him about his dreams, and he even re-interviewed several people who'd been connected to the initial murder case. But just like during the initial investigation, nothing came out of these interviews. After several months of looking into the case again, the detective had nothing new. And so Amy's killer remained unknown and free. And soon her case went cold again. And it would stay that way for almost another decade. On a morning in 2011, so 22 years after Amy's murder, Sergeant Bill Carter, a nuisance and abatement officer with the Indianapolis police, sat in a small office scrolling through Facebook. A nuisance and abatement officer is a cop who works directly with the fire inspector to check on venues like restaurants and clubs that might be breaking fire code. And so Sergeant Carter spent a lot of his time looking at Facebook to see if any events or big parties were being talked about that would potentially violate fire code laws. Just then, Carter heard a knock on his door. He said to come on in, and he looked up to see a homicide detective standing there. This was definitely weird, because Carter had very little interaction with the homicide department. The homicide detective said he was heading up cold cases now, and recently he'd found a Facebook page dedicated to the victim of one of the coldest cases they had, the Amy Widener murder from 1989. Carter said he knew about the case. It had been in the news off and on over the years since it happened, and he'd also grown up in the same part of town as Amy. But none of this explained why a homicide detective would be coming to see him about this case. The homicide detective said he wanted to print off everything from this Facebook page dedicated to Amy to add it to the case files, and to cross-check some of the people on the page with people mentioned in the original investigation. The problem was that he and the other homicide detectives didn't know how to print things off of Facebook, so he was hoping Carter could help them. Carter stifled a laugh and said he'd take care of it. The homicide detective walked off, and then Carter quickly found the Facebook page called Remembering Amy Widener. Even though Carter was familiar with the case, seeing photos of Amy as a happy teenager really hit him. And as he read through the comments on the page, He saw how many people were still deeply affected by this murder. It just seemed so wrong that her friends and family had gone this long without any kind of closure. And so Carter printed out everything from the Facebook page for the homicide detective, but before he did, he sort of read through it all. And as he did, he started to feel like he really needed to do something to help. Over the next several weeks, in his free time, Sergeant Carter started to look through the old case files for Amy's murder. Now, normally, homicide detectives would not have wanted an officer from another department anywhere near their files, especially an officer who only dealt with fire codes. But Amy's case had remained unsolved for so long that they figured whatever Carter was doing couldn't hurt. Sergeant Carter regularly checked the Facebook page dedicated to Amy, made notes on the pages he'd printed, and tried to see if he could connect anything to something in the original case files. He even reached out to several of Amy's friends and family members who'd been interviewed in the past to see if they had any new information to offer. For months, Carter's efforts weren't much different from the detectives who'd worked the case in the past. No new leads, no new evidence. Carter stuck with it, continuing to work Amy's case whenever he had the time. And on a day in June of 2012, now closing in on 23 years after Amy's murder, Sergeant Carter caught something in the case files that seemed to have gone overlooked for decades. At first, Carter thought he had to be wrong. Maybe he'd been spending so much time with the case looking at countless pieces of paper and file folders that he'd just gotten confused, or he was delirious or something. But when he looked at what he'd found in the case file again, and checked it with the Facebook page and the notes he'd taken from the interviews he'd conducted, he was sure he had found something huge, something that apparently no other investigator had noticed. Sergeant Carter looked through the files one more time, found a phone number, grabbed his cell phone, and made a call. And he told the person who answered that he needed to speak to them as soon as possible about Amy's murder. On June 27th, Carter headed over to this person's house to meet them. But when he got there, the person was gone and nobody seemed to know where they went. Soon, Carter found this person had emptied all their bank accounts, quit their job, and just disappeared without a word to anybody. Sergeant Carter couldn't believe it. For the first time in over 20 years, Indianapolis police thought they might be getting closer to solving Amy's murder. But now the person they needed to talk to had fled. And for all Carter knew, this fugitive could be halfway around the world already. A little over a week later, in early July, Carter was at the station with other officers from several departments. A team of Indianapolis police had been working with different agencies to try to track down the fugitive that they believed might be connected to Amy's murder. And now they were waiting to hear something, anything, that might help with their investigation. And luckily for Carter, it didn't take long for him to get what he wanted. And that day, a very excited officer approached Carter and the others. And he said, using credit card data, investigators had discovered that the fugitive had rented a car in town. And using that rented car's OnStar security service, they now knew exactly where that car was parked. Carter asked where it was, half expecting it to be on the other side of the country or somewhere across the border. But the officer said that was not the case at all. The rental car was at a house right here in Indianapolis. Minutes later, police cruisers roared down a residential street and pulled up to a house. Carter and the other officers got out of their cars and quickly approached the front door. Right there in the driveway was the fugitive's rental car. As Carter prepared to knock on the door, several other officers around them put their hands on their holsters, ready to draw their weapons. They didn't know if the fugitive was even inside, but they had to be prepared for anything. Once they were ready, Carter knocked on the door. Moments later, a man answered. Carter told the man who they were looking for, and as soon as he did, suddenly there was a scream coming from inside the house. Carter and several other officers bolted inside, and they found the fugitive standing there in the kitchen. And there was blood running down from the slash on their wrist, and they were holding a knife to their own throat, threatening to kill themselves if the cops came any closer. Carter and the other officers took a breath and tried to keep everybody calm. Several officers talked to the fugitive, urging them to put the knife down and to get medical help. And slowly, the tension in the room eased a bit, and the fugitive did drop the knife. At that point, officers rushed the fugitive, trying to stop the bleeding from their wrist, while making sure the fugitive couldn't hurt themselves or any of the officers or try to make a run for it. An ambulance soon arrived and paramedics sped the fugitive to the hospital, with police following closely behind. And luckily, the fugitive got medical help just in time. And later that day, after Carter and other investigators got to meet with the fugitive in the hospital, they finally figured out, after more than 20 years, who had killed Amy Widener. Based on information from the fugitive's statements, evidence found at the murder scene, and interviews conducted over the course of multiple investigations, the following is what police believe happened to Amy Widener on the morning of November 13th, 1989. On that day, just after 7:30 a.m., the killer walked through the first floor of Amy's house. They moved slowly, and in their hand they gripped a metal pipe. The killer stopped at the bottom of the stairs and listened. They thought they heard someone coughing and maybe some laughter coming from the second floor. The killer walked up the stairs as slowly and quietly as they could, and then crept down a hallway towards Amy's bedroom where they heard the noises. Once they reached the door, they threw it open and they saw Amy sitting up in bed with her little girl. Amy screamed and put her baby down on the floor, then she climbed out of bed and leapt at the killer. Amy threw her fists at the killer and fought back as hard as she could as the little girl ran out of the bedroom. The killer wrapped their arms around Amy and shoved her back onto the bed. Amy kept fighting, but the killer raised the metal pipe and struck Amy on the arms and chest, stunning her. And the killer took off Amy's clothes and sexually assaulted her. But through it all, Amy continued to fight back, constantly slashing at the killer until the killer was bloodied. But at some point, the killer managed to steady themselves against the wall. They raised their metal pipe again, and they slammed it directly into Amy's forehead. At that point, Amy stopped moving. The strike in her head had killed her. But the killer wanted to be sure she really was dead. So after that, they wrapped their hands around Amy's throat, and they strangled her until they knew she had stopped breathing. Then the killer got up and ran out of the room and down the hall, right past Amy's young daughter. Once the killer was back downstairs, they went into JP's room, threw open the dresser drawers, and grabbed the $50 out of one of them. After pocketing the money, they picked up some stereo equipment and then ran out of the house through the sliding door that led onto the back porch. As the killer ran away, they just hoped nobody had seen them and that maybe they would get away with the horrific act they had just committed against their best friend's sister. Rodney Dank, who was JP's best friend and who would remain close to the family following Amy's murder, had been Amy's killer. It turned out he was able to get away with his crime for over 20 years simply because of an oversight. Initially, the police had Rodney listed as one of Amy's close friends that they would need to interview. But for some reason, nobody ever spoke to him. Rodney did not get questioned in the initial investigation or in the secondary investigation when that man had called in to tell police about his dreams. This oversight was what Sergeant Carter, the nuisance and abatement officer, noticed when he started digging into Amy's case in his spare time. He saw Rodney's name listed in the guest book from Amy's funeral, and then he found Rodney mentioned in other notes from the investigation. But he didn't see any record of Rodney ever being interviewed. So Carter tracked Rodney down and set up a meeting with him. At the time, Carter did not have any idea if Rodney had a connection to the murder or if he could even offer any information. He just wanted to speak to Rodney because nobody ever had. But when Carter went to meet Rodney and realized he had fled, that immediately made Rodney the first major suspect the police had in the case in 2 decades. After police finally caught up to Rodney, they discovered that his palm print matched the bloody print found in Amy's room. And while Rodney was recovering in the hospital, he would confess to what he did to Amy. However, in his confession, he did not make it clear if he had gone to the house with that intent, or if he had simply gone there to rob his best friend JP, and then she had been a target of opportunity. It was also never clear if the man who had called the police in 2002 really experienced those dreams that supposedly showed Amy's murder. And police also don't know what caused that man's violent episode on the day Amy died. However, they do know that that particular man who called in about his dreams had absolutely no involvement in Amy's death. Ultimately, Rodney Dank was sentenced to 65 years in prison. Sergeant Carter was named Investigator of the Year by the Indianapolis Police Department based on his work on this case. As for Amy's daughter, she was raised by Amy's mother, Gloria. And when she reached high school, she actually had Jody George, Amy's favorite teacher, for French. And when she graduated, Jody would tell her, "I just remember so many things about your mother and how your mother felt about you. And I know your mother would be so proud of you right now." A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In 1978, a 23-year-old named Stephen Kubacki was attending a college called Hope University in Michigan. It was a small Christian school where he was studying German and history. Stephen was a little more free-spirited than the typical student enrolled at Hope University, which was very conservative. He was a big-time outdoor enthusiast, and he loved to go skiing. In February of 1978, which was just months before Stephen was set to graduate, he decided he wanted to go on a solo ski trip around the Lake Michigan area. And so this area was known as the Lake Michigan Triangle. It's also known as just the Michigan Triangle, and it's an awful lot like the Bermuda Triangle, which is in that northern section of the Atlantic Ocean where planes and boats have gone missing over the years kind of inexplicably. Well, the Michigan Triangle is like that. And starting in the late 1800s, there were all these disappearances that started occurring in the Michigan Triangle area. And so Stephen was going to be skiing around the Lake Michigan area, and so he would be in the Michigan Triangle. Now, he had told his friends and his family that he was just going out for a day trip, and Stephen was a very accomplished outdoorsman, excellent cross-country skier, so really no one bats an eye when he decides to go out and, go skiing. No one even thought twice about it. They're like, all right, cool, we'll see you tomorrow. A day after Stephen had left for this ski trip, some snowmobilers were out in the Michigan Triangle area, and they spotted a trail of ski tracks that led up to the edge of the lake, where at the edge of the lake were a set of skis and 2 ski poles. Just stopped abruptly, and they see that this looks like someone might have fallen into the lake. Now, there weren't any clear breaks in the lake itself, but they figured it was worth telling police and to at least let them know in case they're looking for someone who might have gone missing in the area. And so it was around this time that Stephen Kubacki's friends and family started to recognize that he wasn't back yet, and he should have been. And so they end up calling in an official missing persons report because he should have been back. And so the two things happened in tandem. You have the snowmobilers that have found the ski poles and the skis, and you have the missing persons report that's come out for Stephen Kubacki, and immediately they're connected, and this massive search effort is launched with a focus on where those skis and the poles were found. Now, they looked everywhere, but it was like his tracks went right up to the edge of the lake and then just stopped. There weren't any more tracks on the lake. There were no breaks in the lake. There was nothing there. It was like he just suddenly either went into the ground or just vanished somehow. And so as hundreds of people have descended on this area to look for Steve Kubacki, his backpack shows up right next to his skis and ski poles. That was the first place that everybody went, and his backpack wasn't there. And they didn't really even know how to investigate it. It was just this weird phenomenon where all these people are like, I guess it just must have been there the whole time. They just didn't have a good answer for it. And so after a long and very elaborate search, ultimately they had to call it off. And so they told the family and friends that what must have happened is he got out of his skis and put everything down, went onto the lake, and it cracked and he fell in. And so that's what everybody believed. I mean, why wouldn't they? 15 months go by, and Stephen's father hears a knocking on the door. And who's at the door? Stephen Kubacki. And when he sees his son, he can't believe it because he believed his son was dead. But Kubacki has no idea, Steve has no idea how much time has passed. He saw a newspaper, Stephen saw a newspaper in his father's house, and it showed that it had been 15 months since he disappeared. He asked his father, like, how can this be? And he told Stephen, you were near Lake Michigan. That's 700 miles away. How did you get here? And Stephen's like, I woke up in a field about 40 miles from here, and I went to my aunt's house, your sister's house, and she brought me here. And no one had any idea how he got there or why he was in the field in Pittsfield to begin with. In addition, Stephen had on clothes that he didn't recognize. He had a new backpack that had maps and all sorts of kind of like trinkets from different parts of the country. He had been to apparently San Francisco, Sacramento, all over California, to Chicago, to Utah. He's been all over the country, according to the things that are in his backpack. He had $40 in cash. He had new sneakers, new glasses, and he had a t-shirt on from a Wisconsin marathon. It says he was a participant in. And one of the only things that Stephen would say to the media, because he basically swore off the media and he didn't want to give his story to anybody, he just said to one of the news outlets that he felt like he had been doing a lot of running. But other than that, we don't know what he was doing for 15 months, and apparently he doesn't either. In early 2018, Danny Philippidis was a 49-year-old firefighter living in Canada. He had a wife, he had 2 kids, he was happy, healthy, successful, and every year, he and his colleagues at the firehouse would go on a ski trip to New York, where they would go skiing at a mountain called Whiteface. And so on February 7th, 2018, Danny and his 7 colleagues are at Whiteface. They're enjoying themselves. Danny was an avid skier. Like, this is something he really looked forward to, was this annual retreat to Whiteface Mountain. And it was getting to be lunchtime, and his 7 colleagues said, hey, let's go down to the lodge and get a bite to eat. Danny was just having a great time on the mountain, and he was like, I'm gonna just do a couple more runs. I'll meet you guys in about 30 minutes or so. I'm gonna do a couple more runs before lunch. So they go down to the lodge, and Danny continues to do a couple more runs. And so after an hour or so, and Danny still hasn't shown up at the lodge, his 7 colleagues have finished eating, and they're like, you know what? I bet Danny just decided he wanted to skip lunch, and he's probably just fine. And so they end up just going out and skiing the rest of the day. But by the end of the night, when the mountain is starting to shut down, they're all checking their phones for messages from Danny. They haven't gotten anything from him. They haven't seen him. They decide, let's go check out, his room back at the hotel and make sure that he's there. Maybe he got sick and he left, something like that. And the resort was attached to the mountain itself. So they just walked right over to his room. They knocked, he didn't answer, but then they went out back and they found his car, and his car was still there. They went to the front desk, they explained the situation. They ended up going in the room and checking to see if he was in there. He wasn't, but all of his personal belongings are still inside of the room. So Danny, who has not shown up after going skiing for this additional run, clearly hasn't left the mountain because his car's still here, his cash, his passport, everything is in his room, but no one knows where Danny is. And so they launched this massive search for Danny. And I mean, this day it was so crowded at Whiteface. There's so many people there. And also it had snowed a ton before they even started skiing that day. So it would have been very difficult to move very far off the mountain, let's say, if someone wanted to. There was too much snow on the ground. So he couldn't have gotten very far. And there were lots of people there that they could interview to say, have you seen this man? They had a picture of him, and no one had seen him. And there was no sign of him. Despite this massive search effort, no one has any idea what happened to him. The authorities call off the search and they tell his loved ones and his friends that, Danny must have succumbed to the elements. That's the only explanation we can give. We can't find him now because the snow's pretty deep, but hopefully when the weather warms up, we'll be able to launch another search and we can recover his body. And so that's the news that's passed to his wife, to his kids, to his friends, and it's just devastating. And then a couple days later, Danny's wife is home, trying to adjust to this awful new normal, and she gets a phone call from a number she doesn't recognize. And she picks it up, and it's a little bit hard to hear, but she immediately recognizes her husband's voice. And she can tell right away that there's something wrong. Like he's not making sense. She's like, Danny, is that you? Is that you? And Danny's like, I don't know where I am. I don't know how I got here. Where are you? What am I doing? And so she immediately tells him, you have to call the police. You have to call the police. They have to come get you. And finally he agrees and he hangs up. The police receive a phone call from Danny and he doesn't know where he is. He's saying that, my wife told me to call you. I'm very confused. I don't know what's going on. And they ask him to describe where he is. And he starts describing what's around him. And police are able to, eventually pinpoint where he is. And it turns out he was near Sacramento, California, 2,900 miles away from Whiteface Mountain. Even more strangely, when the police go to collect Danny, He's still wearing his ski gear, winter jacket, winter pants, ski boots on. He even still had his goggles on his head. And he has a haircut. He has a fresh haircut, and he has a brand new phone, a brand new iPhone. But he had no money. He had no wallet. He had nothing. He had left all of his belongings in his room. So looking at him like, how did you get a new phone? How did you get a haircut? Why did you get a new haircut? And when you got your haircut, why didn't the person cutting your hair let someone know that a man who's visibly confused wearing ski gear is getting a haircut in here? And so it's just a totally strange mystery that Danny, to this day, and anybody that knows Danny and his friends, the investigators, everybody, no one knows how he got there. How does a guy without a car, without any money, wearing ski gear, go from New York to Sacramento, California, somehow get a haircut and buy a new phone, and then just suddenly come to and be like, oh, that's right, I'm Danny, and I'm gonna call my wife and let her know where I am now. Like, it was just crazy. So this last story was documented in the official American Ethnology Report from 1897, 1898. Although the story is, well documented in this report, the location is unclear. People have speculated that it's either Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. So just take this with a grain of salt that the location is not known. It's an older story, but it was officially documented in an official report. In 1898, a 12-year-old boy was playing at this river that ran near his house. He was out in the forest, he was playing to this river, and he had a bow and arrow, and he was practicing shooting his bow and arrow. And after a little while, he got bored of his bow and arrow, and he went to the stream itself, and he started to build a little dam in the river to try to catch some fish. And as he's building this thing up, he's down on his knees building up this little dam in the river, he notices someone is walking down the river towards him. And he looks up, and he would describe this person as looking normal, a normal-looking stranger. It's a gentleman who shows up. He's wearing a nice suit. He walks over to Wofford, and he apparently just came out of the woods. And he says, hey, what are you doing? And the boy, he's like, oh, I'm making this fish trap. And he's like, man, that looks like a lot of work. Like, you should take a break. And the boy's like, yeah, I guess I could take a break. And the gentleman just says, well, if you want, while you're taking this break, you can come to my house. It's just up past the bend here. My family's there. You can have a meal with us, and then you can come back and you can finish your fish trap. And so, this is a different time. This is the late 1800s, and I'm not suggesting that at the time it was totally cool to go with strangers into weird houses in the forest, but the boy felt compelled to say yes. He didn't want to be rude, and maybe his fear of strangers is less extreme than it is, for us today in 2020. And so he agrees to go with the man. They make their way up past the river into the forest a little bit, and they come up to this cabin. Now, the boy played in the woods here, and he had never seen this house before. But he's not too concerned, because as soon as he gets to the house, this cabin in the woods, he sees that the lights are on, and he hears kids playing inside, and a close family friend of his family's is sitting on the porch talking to one of the other apparently family members of the stranger. And so the boy's put at ease, and he says hi to the family friend, and the family friend, waves back. The boy goes inside, and he sees that this family has a couple of kids, roughly his age. They're playing, goofing around. They have dinner, and this wonderful meal, and the boy, Wofford, is like, man, this is so great. And after the meal, he lays down and falls asleep. He kind of loses track of time. The boy falls asleep at this cabin. And so he wakes up early the next morning, and he feels horrible because he didn't mean to fall asleep, and he didn't tell anyone from his family where he was going. And he's thinking, man, they're going to be so worried about me. And so as he's getting up to leave, the stranger is already awake, the one that had met him down by the river and called him up to the house. And the boy says, hey, can you walk me down back to the river? And the stranger's like, I can take you part of the way down, sure. So the two of them, they're having small talk, and the boy's thanking the man for his generosity. And so as they're walking, they're passing by an orchard on one side and a cornfield on the other. And it's this beautiful morning, the sun's just coming up, and the boy remembers thinking how beautiful the setting was. But he also was thinking, like, I don't even know where I am right now. And I'm assuming he's walking me back to where I live, but this doesn't look familiar at all. And the stranger stops. They get to almost a junction right at the end of the orchard and of the cornfield. And the stranger tells the boy, Wofford, he says, hey, just go straight. You're going to turn down this way, turn back, and you'll be at the river again where we met. And the boy thanks the stranger, and the stranger turns and starts walking back towards his cabin and says, "Hey, good luck, see ya." And the boy starts following the man's directions. And Wofford, as he's walking, following the stranger's directions, he's suddenly curious and turns around to look back at this strange person who had brought him up to the house and then now brought him back. And he's stunned because suddenly the orchard and the cornfield are not there. There is no orchard or cornfield. It's just deep, dark forest. And he's like, what's going on? He turns back and there's a search party, or it looks like a search party, running up to him. Part of the search party is the family friend that he had seen at the house. And the boy's like looking at these people running towards him, like they're running to him. And he recognizes the family friend, and he can tell they're like urgently looking for him. And he felt bad because he knows he slept over through the night. So he's like, "Hey, I'm here. And they're like, "Where have you been?" And the boy turns to the family friend and he's like, "Didn't you tell them I was with you?" And the family friend is like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "Yeah, the house with the family. We ate dinner together last night." And the family friend is like, "I've been looking for you for the past several days. I've been with your family looking for you. You've been gone for 3 days." And the boy is like, "What?" And as he's describing the kind of general vicinity of where this cabin was, he's kind of pointing back up towards where it was and describing it from where the river was. The family says to him that since you've been missing, we've heard rhythmic drumming non-stop coming from the section of the forest that you just described. We could never pinpoint where it was coming from. And now that you just showed up, the drumming has stopped. And so the kid's terrified, but there's no answers. Pretty creepy. So 3 very strange stories that luckily all of them ended with the person being found again. But it doesn't change the fact that the mystery remains. Where did they go? It's like they left the earth for a couple of days, or in Stephen Kubaki's case, for over a year, and then came back. It was like a glitch in the matrix or something. And so I would love to hear in the comments what you think can possibly explain how these people are disappearing without a trace and then reappearing days, weeks, months, years later, not having any idea how they got there or what had happened to them. How can we possibly reconcile that? And if you like this video and you want to see more videos like this, I would ask you to please gently perform a lobotomy on the like button, and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my other 3 to 4 weekly uploads that I do every week that sound an awful lot like the story you just heard. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen.
On the afternoon of July 18th, 1997, a man was driving down a road surrounded on both sides by trees in a rural part of Wisconsin called Douglas County. There were no other cars on the road, and so this guy was driving pretty fast. And as he rounded this bend in the road, something out the passenger side window on the side of the road in the grass caught his eye. He couldn't tell what it was, but it was a pretty big object, and after he drove right past it, he just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like, whatever it was, it just seemed out of place. And so for whatever reason, this man felt compelled to actually stop and go see what it was. And so he slowed down and parked on the shoulder. He got out and began walking along the road back in the direction of this object. And as he got closer, he began to see this object again in the shoulder of the road, and it was sort of obscured by grass and other things, so he couldn't see what it was. But as he got closer, he saw the object was pretty big, and it was all white. And as he took a few more steps and got within maybe 20 or 30 feet, he finally got a better look at this object, and he just froze. Because the object was a man wearing all white, a white suit, a white belt, white shoes, all white, and he was laying on the side of the road, just totally motionless. And for a second, the driver thought, maybe this guy is sleeping, but after taking only a few more steps and getting a totally unobstructed view at this guy, he saw there was a gaping hole in this man's chest. He was obviously dead. And so the driver turned around, ran back to his car, sped to the nearest house, and called 911. The next morning, a Douglas County detective named Stephen Long was sitting at his desk looking at the photos of the dead man in white. This murder case was less than 24 hours old, but already this was one of the weirder cases that this detective had ever been assigned to. The victim had pretty much immediately been identified because he was carrying on his person his wallet, and in his wallet was his driver's license, and so they knew who he was. But the man in white's identity actually made the whole case more confusing, not less. And Mark had no obvious ties to the area, So what was this rich guy doing 3 hours from home, dressed all in white, getting shot to death on the side of the road? Like, it didn't add up. The dead man was a 45-year-old millionaire named Mark Foster. And Mark lived 3 hours away in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and had no discernible ties to Douglas County. And so the detective was thinking, like, what is this rich guy doing here, dressed head to toe, all in white, getting murdered on the side of some local random back road? But things only got more confusing from there. After the medical examiner did Mark's autopsy, he told Detective Long that he had discovered a note inside of Mark's shoe. And the note just said, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey, or a lookalike? I hope I'm okay." Now, nobody, including Detective Long, had any idea what this note meant. It was far too cryptic. But when they ran Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey's names through their database, the police discovered that both of those men, one, existed, and two, they lived in Minnesota, same as Mark Foster. And so naturally, Detective Long began to suspect that maybe those two men were connected in some way to Mark Foster. Maybe they were involved in his murder, or maybe they were actually his killer or killers. He didn't know, but it was his best lead. So Detective Long decided he would just have to go to Minneapolis to try to find out more. A few hours later, Detective Long parked his car at the Minneapolis police station. He got out and walked inside the building. Waiting for him inside was the local detective who Mark had already spoken to. And so after meeting this detective, the two of them went into an interview room where Mark Foster's wife was waiting for them. And right away, Detective Long noticed that she was very pregnant and at least 15 or 20 years younger than Mark. But despite that, she seemed very composed. It would turn out she had already been told about her husband's death, and she was basically resigned to the fact that she was here to try to answer questions to figure out what happened. And so the detective sat down and they began to interview her. And then when they brought up the note that was found in Mark's shoe, specifically when they said the two names that were on that note, Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, when they said that, it triggered something in Mark Foster's wife. She immediately began to cry, and then in between sobs, she would tell the detectives that she knew who those two men were. She told them that she had previously had relationships with both of them before marrying Mark. And she said after she married Mark, Jack and Jimmy became very jealous. They didn't like the idea that she had chosen Mark over them. And so she had always felt like those two, Jack and Jimmy, sort of had it out for Mark as a result of this romantic rivalry. After the interview with Mark's wife ended, Detective Long began to think that, despite this case appearing on the surface to be very odd and confusing, that perhaps in reality, it was quite simple. Maybe Jimmy and Jack were so jealous of Mark that they killed Mark. I mean, based on what Mark's wife had just told them in the interview about them being romantic rivals of Mark, and also the fact that that note was in Mark's shoe and named those two men, it certainly seemed very possible. But over the next couple of days that Detective Long began digging into this theory, that theory fell apart. Because it would turn out Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey had absolutely airtight alibis. They simply couldn't have been the killers. Now, Detective Long was obviously frustrated. He felt like he really had it here. But he was not deterred. He decided his next move would be to try to better understand his victim. To this point, he had already interviewed a lot of Mark's friends and family, but something he had not done yet was simply go to Mark's house and have a look around. So Detective Long got a search warrant, and on July 29th, roughly a week after Mark was killed, Detective Long, along with another detective, pulled up in front of Mark Foster's large 2-story home in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Now, from the outside, the home looked totally ordinary relative to its neighbors. But once they got inside the house, it was anything but. The detectives made their way up to the front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, Mark Foster's wife opened up the door and let them inside. And right away, Detective Long is looking around, and he's seeing all over the walls on the first floor of the house are these graphic pictures and paintings of naked people. And then in addition to that, on some of the coffee tables and various surfaces on the first floor, right when you walk in, are all these pornographic magazines and books everywhere. And Mark's wife didn't acknowledge any of it. She acted like it was completely normal to have all this stuff right in the front part of your house. And so the two detectives are looking at each other as, Mark's wife is leading them on this tour through the first floor. And at some point, Detective Long just said, "Hey, Mrs. Foster, why don't you have a seat on the couch and you just let us take a look around your house on our own?" And so she said, okay. She sat down on the couch, and then the two detectives, they left the living room, went back to the front of the house, and made their way upstairs. And once they got upstairs, they found the master suite, and there was all this bondage gear inside. There were leather straps attached to the bedposts, there was whips and handcuffs, there was also additional pornographic material in there. But, I mean, considering what the detectives had seen downstairs, this sort of felt on par for this house. And so after searching the other bedrooms and other rooms on the second floor and finding more pornographic material basically everywhere, the detectives found their way back to the hallway in the second floor, and they noticed there was a rope hanging down from the ceiling, and it was attached to the pull door that led to the attic. And so the two detectives, they walked over, they pulled the rope down, it revealed this fold-out set of stairs that came down from the attic, and once those were in place, the two detectives began climbing up. And once they got up there, they discovered that this attic was not a storage space like many attics are in American homes. Instead, this attic was a fully functional room that sort of resembled like a satanic dungeon of sorts. All the walls were totally jet black, and there were all these burned out candles all over the place and tarot cards littering the floor. And on the back of the attic, basically all the way on the other side, there was what appeared to be an altar that sort of overlooked the entire room. And on the altar were more candles, and there was a voodoo doll. I mean, it's totally creepy, and the two detectives are looking at each other like, what's going on here? And so the detectives, they climbed all the way into the attic, and then slowly began walking across towards the altar. And when they got close enough to actually see the altar up close, they just froze. Because sitting on the altar, in addition to the candles and the voodoo doll, were two business cards. Their own business cards. Detective Long and his partner immediately went downstairs and confronted Mark's wife about the attic. Like, what's going on up there? Why are our business cards on your altar? But Mark's wife, the second that attic was mentioned, went silent. She refused to speak about anything to do with the attic. And so after a minute, realizing this conversation was going nowhere, Detective Long and his partner called for backup. And as they waited for backup, the two of them stepped away from Mark's wife and began speculating like, is this a cult? Was Mark a part of a cult that like ran it out of his attic? Like, what's going on here? And are we being targeted by the cult? Is that why our names are on the altar? A few minutes later, backup arrived, and they would do a much more extensive search of the property. But other than finding more pornographic materials and, bondage gear, there really wasn't anything else substantive that connected Mark or his wife to what happened to Mark, or what Mark was even doing in this house. Was he in a cult? They didn't know. And so ultimately, Detective Long and his partner told Mark's wife, who still is being quiet at this point, that she should not leave town because they were going to follow up with her soon. Now, in fairness, Detective Long couldn't tell if Mark's wife was being silent and not talking about what was going on in her house because, she was complicit in some way in what happened to Mark, or if she was maybe being threatened by somebody and she was afraid to talk. They didn't know. But either way, after leaving the property after the search was over, Detective Long and his partner felt like their next move was to try to learn more about cults. They needed a cult expert. And it just so happened there was an occult bookstore very close to Mark's house. And so they decided they would start there. And right away, their decision to go to that bookstore paid dividends, but not how the detectives expected. It would turn out the owner of that bookstore was indeed a cult expert. But much more importantly, and relevant to this case, was that the owner happened to personally know Mark Foster. And he told the detectives that Mark came to his bookstore all the time, and also the owner said he knew a bunch of Mark's friends. And so by the time the detectives left the bookstore, they had learned a little bit about cults, but more importantly, they left with a list of names the owner had given them of known associates of Mark Foster who maybe were involved in whatever was going on in Mark's house. And so maybe they had information about what happened to Mark. The detectives were able to track down everybody on this list very quickly, and they were all young people in their 20s. And in each of the interviews they conducted, each of these young people were very open about being in what they called a religious group that they said Mark was a part of as well. Now, the detectives theorized that this religious group was very likely a cult, like they believed, but they didn't call it a cult. They called it a group. But the detectives didn't let up. They kept pressing these people until eventually a new name surfaced, Greg Freisner. Now, none of these people said Greg was in charge of the cult. Instead, they just sort of said, well, talk to Greg if you want more information about our group. The detectives naturally began to wonder if this Greg person was the cult leader, or maybe he was Mark's killer, or maybe he was both. But regardless, it seemed pretty apparent that they needed to talk to Greg because he might have more information about what happened to Mark. It took a few days, but the detectives were able to track Greg down, and they brought him in for an interview. And boy oh boy, did Greg have a story to tell. Based on what Greg told the detectives, here is what happened to Mark on the day that he died, on July 18th, 1997. On that day, Greg Freisner met Mark Foster at Mark's home. And when Mark came outside, he was dressed head to toe in white, something he would do for special ceremonies. And so Mark, he came down the steps, didn't say a word to Greg. They went to Greg's car. Greg hopped in the driver's seat, and Mark climbed into the back seat. And before long, they took off and began driving northeast. And for hours, these two just drove in total silence. Mark just stared out the window, and Greg focused on driving. The only thing that happened during this multi-hour-long drive was at some point Mark pulled out a piece of paper from his coat pocket, and he wrote something on it, and then after staring at it, he kind of smiled and tucked it into his shoe. And then a little bit later, Greg pulled over on the side of the road in Douglas County, Wisconsin, on this random backcountry road. And as soon as they pulled over, again without saying anything, Greg and Mark got out of the car and they went around to the back of the car where the trunk was. And the two men are kind of stretching, it's been a long drive, taking in the scenery. And then before long, Greg pops open the trunk. And in the trunk is a rifle. Neither men have any strong reaction to this. Greg just reaches down, pulls the rifle out, and Mark, calm as can be, just begins walking over to the side of the road, to the shoulder. And then once he got to the shoulder, Greg came over and stood right in front of him and just looked intently into Mark's eyes, looking for the signal. And at some point, after Mark kind of composed himself, he nodded at Greg, at which point Greg raised that rifle, placed the barrel directly on Mark's chest, and fired. Mark crumpled to the ground, and he laid there for a second just moaning horribly, and Greg just stood over him watching until finally Mark went silent and died, at which point Greg casually went back to his car, got inside, and drove home. The only time he stopped was to throw his rifle into a nearby river. But once Greg got home, he was overjoyed because he knew the sacred ritual he had just carried out with Mark had been a total success. It had gone exactly to plan. It would turn out Mark Foster was absolutely a member of that religious group, the cult, if you will. Except he was not just a member. He was the cult's leader. And Mark is the one who orchestrated his own death. However, Mark did not view his death as him actually dying. Quite the opposite.
We celebrate life as we celebrate death. Death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is a great crossroads, a change in attitude, a change in longitude, a change in the way that we perceive our spirit. When we reach that portal, they'll ring some golden bells.
He believed that what he and Greg, his most devout follower, were going to do, this sacred ritual, was after Greg fires the shot into his chest and ends this body's life, that his soul, his consciousness, and his power will be transferred into Greg. Basically, his soul will go into Greg. And Mark believed once this transfer happened, that basically he would be immortal, that his soul would never die. It would stay in Greg and then maybe at some point get transferred to somebody else, but basically he would be here forever. The bizarre note that was found in Mark's shoe, the note that he wrote and stuffed in there, that note was designed to throw police off the trail. He knew that he was having Greg murder him, again for this ritual, but he wanted to make sure Greg didn't get caught. And so he wrote on the note very specifically Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey. Those two people he hated. He hated that they had been in past relationships with his wife, and they hated him. And so he figured if he was going to create a scapegoat for his murder, who better than his romantic rivals? They had nothing to do with it. He just named them in that cryptic note to get them in trouble. As for all the pornography and bondage gear that was found inside of Mark's home, well, that all played a role in Mark's cult as well. He was a firm believer that the more sex he had with his followers, often multiple followers at the same time, the more powerful he would become. As for the detective's business cards found on the altar up in the attic, those were very likely placed there by followers of Mark, so members of the cult, in an effort to potentially, thwart their efforts to solve the case. They might have believed that by placing those on there and performing various rituals, that somehow would prevent them from solving the case. We don't know for sure. That's the theory around why they were there, but obviously that didn't work because the detectives solved the case. Greg Freisner would ultimately be found guilty for playing a role in Mark's death. He obviously was the trigger man, and so he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As for Mark's wife, although she definitely knew about the cult and may have been a participant, there was never any evidence that actually connected her to Mark's murder. and so she was never charged with any crime.
An American submarine, L2, was hurrying to assist a Portuguese freighter, which had been torpedoed near Padstow, when she had encountered UB-65 sitting motionless on the surface. As Lieutenant Augustine Grant prepared to give the order to sink the unsuspecting enemy vessel, he paused momentarily. Through his binoculars, he could see